Hi, I'm Phoebe Shaw. Welcome to Pipeline Practices for the Growing Studio. I'm super excited to be delivering this talk. It's part pipeline walkthrough, part history lesson, and a little bit of my own personal philosophy. I want to be really clear that while this is a showcase of how I've set up my pipeline to meet the very specific project needs at Mighty Kingdom, this is really only one path to take, and my choices might not work as well for your own projects. I would love to see what you do with your own pipelines and how you take your own sort of philosophy to it. I am a character TD at Mighty Kingdom. I've been here for a little over 4 years, and I've spent a lot of that time working on the 3D asset pipeline and in the character rigging department. My background is in film. I have an advanced diploma in screen and media from AIE, and I actually worked in VFX at Rising Sun Pictures for the smallest amount of time before making the jump to the games industry. In my time in film, I learned character rigging for digital body doubles. My team was working on assets that were going through daily changes, and we had a really agile and iterative approach to rebuilding rigs very frequently, so that animation, lighting, and other downstream departments could always have access to the very latest model. Working on projects for studios like Marvel, that was sort of a way of life where we had a lot of changes that we needed to make pretty often, and we had to be very agile to meet that. This is the approach that I brought to Mighty Kingdom, and in a lot of ways, it really applies an agile mindset to content creation. I think it puts a lot of power into the hands of artists, riggers, and animators to test their work quickly and easily without the pain and time sink of manual work and without creating bottlenecks waiting for other departments. I'm really excited to share this with you. Let's take a look at the overview for the talk and then jump right in. This talk is mostly aimed at people who already have a solid understanding of the content creation workflow and are looking to raise the bar on their pipelines by automating repetitive processes and minimizing human error margins. We're going to look at an overview of the asset creation pipeline. We're going to break it down a little bit and modularize it. We'll take a look at 3 core projects that have shaped the pipeline at Mighty Kingdom over time. I'm going to share with you my tips for effective automation, as well as my top 3 things to avoid when automating processes. Then we have a couple of demos for my rigging and export processes. I hope that all sounds good to you. Let's get right into it. This is a diagram of some of the key steps in the asset pipeline. It's a pretty linear view of the process, but in reality, we work in parallel most of the time. We like to proportion test characters as early as we can, so the first version of the rig is usually handed over to animation before the model is even finished. Sometimes we're even rigging on a decimated version of the sculpt just to get it through as early as possible. Something to note about this pipeline is that we use an asset tagging system which handles metadata for every asset in the project. I'm going to demo the asset library for you a little bit later, but for now, when I'm talking about metadata, that's what I'm referring to. The rig build is a step that can change pretty drastically from project to project. Our current rigs are fully using a proprietary rigging system now, but a couple of years ago, there were still some legacy rigs that had advanced skeleton in them. Some projects and rigs have pretty specific needs as well. We have to cater to bipeds and quadrupeds and slightly different skeleton structures depending on the engine needs. I want the user experience of this step to feel almost the same for the rigger no matter what they're rigging. So this is almost fully automated. I'm going to expand on this step later in the talk, so we will come back to it, but I'm pretty happy with where it is right now, and I'm really excited to share it with you. Rig export is even more varied than rig prep. Some of our rigs are built using skeletons from projects that we've inherited from other studios that don't match our proprietary system, or even projects that we have in partnership with studios that have their own skeleton that we need to use. I use this pretty simple asset tagging system to direct the project flow here. If a rig is tagged with, say, the Sugar Slam key, it'll direct to the Sugar Slam exporter. But if it's untagged, it'll use the boilerplate exporter. The same goes with handling rigs that rely on blend shapes. Any blend shapes are tagged in the rig's metadata and only exported if needed. I found this is a pretty neat way to get a lot of pipeline control under the hood without muddying the user experience of exports. I've included animation in this diagram, but obviously that's an artistic process and not an automated one. I thought it was important to include here to highlight that no matter which blocks are used in the process leading up to the animation, the user experience should pretty much be always the same for the animator. They should be able to focus on the art. This leads into the bake and export part of the process. This is usually carried out by the animator to give them the most freedom and control over testing their work in Engine, but the setup does mean that anyone can do these exports. So if there have been rig or model changes and we suddenly need to rebake every animation in a project, I usually try to share that workload as best we can. We use a push button export, so there are not a lot of steps involved, but we don't have a farm quite yet, so the exporter does tie up your computer for a couple of minutes if you're doing heaps of exports. I will be giving a bit of a demo about this one as well later on, so sit tight, that's going to be fun, I hope. Engine pickup is probably a part of the pipeline that's modularized the least. I did think it was important to put in here though. We have a couple of different model preprocessors that we apply on a project basis. We've never needed to get any more granular than that. So we just set it up at the beginning of a project and then it's pretty much plug and play from there. We're going to take a look at 3 projects from Mighty Kingdom that I've run the asset pipeline for. I consider them all to be pretty big milestones in my own professional development and in the pipeline that we use today. I'm constantly looking for opportunities to iterate and optimize on the pipelines, and these 3 projects really stand out to me as drivers of change in the pipeline. They had a lot of common needs between them, especially when it comes to character work, and they've offered a great opportunity to iterate on character. Lego Friends Heartlake Rush was the first project I worked on at Mighty Kingdom. This project is a 3-lane runner featuring mini dolls from the Lego Friends line. So there are lots and lots of characters, but their models are very similarly proportioned for the most part. When I arrived, the team was really small and was already using some pretty neat tricks to optimize the workflows. The doll characters were all skinned to the one advanced skeleton rig, which allowed them to share animations and save a huge amount of time. Advanced Skeleton is a great off-the-shelf solution for quick rigs. It has the power to rebuild your rig from the guide skeleton at the click of a button, which makes life really easy when there's a model or proportion change. While I do have my own proprietary rigging system, I'm a big advocate for off-the-shelf rigging solutions. You don't have to reinvent the wheel if you don't need to, or if you have a small studio and maybe don't have the people power to do so. We used the game exporter plugin for Maya at this time. This worked pretty well for our needs. It had great clip management, which we really took advantage of. The only automation I really did at this time was to rig and export the 2D faces on the mini dolls. The 2D faces were animated on the UVs in Maya to scroll around a texture sheet. So when we got to the export phase, I serialized that data down to a JSON, which we imported into Unity and directed to animate a texture around the face. It was a pretty neat setup and it supported us well for the needs that we had at the time. Wildlife Puzzle Story is a narrative puzzle game about our friend Chloe, who is fixing up her old family farm for sale. She meets many animal and human friends along the way, and every character in this game is incredibly unique, which really elevated our needs for a strong character pipeline. We also decided to use renders of feature quality rigs in-game for all of our main characters, so that added some extra challenges to the character pipeline. When Wildlife picked up, we spent a portion of the pre-production time looking into rigging frameworks that worked really well for a broad number of animal rigs. We were suddenly looking at the need for our rigs to support quadrupeds with all number of different leg and foot requirements, and it was time for us to move to something new. At Mighty Kingdom, the modeling, rigging, and animation departments frequently work in parallel. We often start animation testing on a character before the model is final, so it's very important to me that any rig can be rebuilt on a whim. This and the animal character needs formed the brief for our next framework. In the end, I decided to write my own. We hadn't found a framework that worked for our needs and also fit the budget, so I coded a quadruped rig with modular body parts that can be switched out on the fly. For example, the equine rig, which we use for the mountain goat and any horses, inherits from the quadruped class but replaces the quadruped foot with a hoof and adds in the elbow knee situation that horses have going on. This framework ran in parallel with the biped rig builds, which were still done using advanced skeleton. I didn't see a need to replace that at that time. I did complicate things further by using our own framework for the facial rigging for the high poly renderable characters. So this was a mixture of hand rigging and scripts. So it was about 90% coded, but it wasn't a push button like the quadruped was. We also used Wildlife as an opportunity to automate our export process a little further. I was finding, using Python, that the Maya game exporter settings were sometimes a little inconsistent depending on the scene. It didn't talk super well with automation for me. So the first iteration of our animation manager was born. Looking back on this tool, I see a lot of things that I would have done differently, but it did its job in automating the export process for rigs and animation, as well as targeting props for local space baking. I've iterated on so many things since Wildlife that none of the code would be the same today, but I still consider this the project where the pipeline was born in a lot of ways. Avas Manor was another really exciting milestone project for me. Another narrative puzzle game, we follow Ava, a mystery novelist, to a French mansion that she's suddenly and mysteriously inherited. The mansion is terribly run down. The butler, Olive, has not been able to keep up with the needs of the place on her own, and it needs a lot of support. Similarly to Wildlife, we meet a huge cast of human and animal characters. We currently have about 20 unique characters in the game, and there are more to come. We decided to move away from pre-rendered characters for this project and put our resources into exploring bone-based facial rigging for mobile, which is a little lower fidelity than the fully rendered characters, but it gave us the opportunity to have some really lovely and engaging character animation in-game. Check it out on the App Store if you haven't played it. I'm so proud of what we've done with it. We knew going into this project that a lot of the technical needs would be the same or very similar to Wildlife. So in a lot of ways, this was a great opportunity to iterate and to do the same again but better. I evolved the rigging code to include bipeds to bring the user experience of all the rigs to the same level. And we also developed a prototype for characters with bone-based facial rigs, which you will be able to see in Avas Manor. This system is extremely modularized. Every rig inherits from the same base class, and it makes changing things up really simple for me. Minor characters have fewer bones in the skeleton than hero characters, and this has almost no impact on animation control. I also took the opportunity to iterate on the animation export tool I developed for wildlife. I was supporting multiple 3D projects at this stage, and the old tool wasn't quite ready to support multiple frameworks. We also changed up the way we store animation files, so it wasn't important to have a clip manager anymore, which meant I needed to focus more on file management and batch exports and slightly less on clip management and scene management. So I modularized it a little further, and it became the asset library that we use today. I won't go over the whole tool in detail, but the main idea is to service any project as needed without creating extra user experience points. The asset library is kind of a glorified file browser in a lot of ways. So at its core, you can select any animation files you need and batch export them with the click of a button. Initially, artists used to select the exporter for the specific project that they were using. This created a lot more menus than I wanted, and it complicated the user experience. So I iterated, and we've moved to a single export, which uses the asset tagging system to run the export code that is right for the project. I'm now going to demonstrate a walkthrough of these two key workflows. We're going to have a bit of a look at my top do and do nots when automating systems. Then we're going to build a rig using the proprietary code, but this philosophy can be applied to many off-the-shelf solutions as well. If you're really interested in learning more about this process, one of the developers of GCAP has a really great YouTube video on the data-centric rigging pipeline, which uses all the same elements. The animation export pipeline seems pretty simple on the surface, so I'll be breaking it down a little more about how I've modularized it to be more robust over time. Every building block in the modular pipeline should adhere to these guides, really. I also take this philosophy in when I'm designing any tool. First, we have user-first design. That might seem obvious, but in the fog of war or automation, it can be really easy to forget the intended audience for a tool. It's very important to me to frequently check in with the users of tools, find out their pain points and bottlenecks, and try to make that pain go away. Justify technical debt. This sort of speaks for itself. It's kind of not chill to spend a bunch of money developing a tool that will never get used. So to avoid that, I make sure to check in with users before I start development to find out if I'm even solving a problem that they have or just a perceived problem that I think they may have. Users usually avoid tools and processes that are broken or that they don't understand very well. So this sort of goes hand in hand with the first point. The more helpful a tool is, the more money it'll save. So taking the time to optimize tool helpfulness and documentation is really key here. Work within existing systems. I find if you're reinventing the pipeline every few months, your team will likely feel like they're on a roller coaster. It might be hard for users to know what's expected of them, and this can be really disengaging. The best thing I try to do here is to stick to under the hood edits and additions that cause minimal disruption to the user experience, unless I really set that expectation that the UX will be changing. And legacy project support. This is one of the biggest culture shocks for me, having moved from the VFX industry. If we're still supporting the art pipeline of a shipped project, it might be 3, 4, or 5 years old, and any changes to the tools still need to work. This can be pretty brutal sometimes, especially since the pipeline at Mighty Kingdom has gone through so many changes. And I think there's a bit of give and take depending on how frequently we develop new content for legacy projects. but it is pretty constantly in my mind when I make changes. You've probably heard the term programmer trap. There are also pipeline traps that we need to watch out for when automating to this extent. These are my big three. Tool dependency. It's really important to me that we automate the workflows and handovers of the team without creating too many magic buttons. There's a bit of a fine line here, but in my perfect scenario, artists will be able to use and rely on their tools, but won't feel completely lost if a tool breaks or if they suddenly need to work off pipeline for whatever reason. Something that I really try to keep front of mind is educating users on what the tool is actually doing under the hood. So if they ever need to work without it, they can do that. It might just take a bit more time or more steps if I've done my job right. Pipeline OCD. This can strike pipeline developers, and it's that overwhelming urge for everything to be the same or to be on the same page. This means file structures, naming conventions, that sort of thing. I definitely agree that things should be consistent where they can be. But in reality, when you have up to a dozen artists, riggers, and animators working on a project, not everything's going to be exactly the same. In my opinion, this shouldn't really break a strong pipeline, and it's worth challenging the OCD when it comes up to ask yourself, so it's different, but does it break anything? Is it worth the engineering cost to bring it into alignment with everything else, or can it wait until the next project? And finally, too many changes to the pipe. The inventor and perfectionist in me is way too often tempted to fix things or to iterate on systems that are working perfectly fine already. For the most part, under the hood changes should be okay as long as they're thoroughly tested and won't complicate legacy data. I do prefer to err on the side of caution when it comes to changes to the user experience or file output. I prefer to save these changes up for major project milestones instead and try to work closely with the users to create as smooth a transition as possible for change. This is not to say that tools shouldn't be agile. I very strongly think they should be, but I also equally believe in thorough testing, communication, and working closely with users to make changes as easy as possible. Okay, we're gonna build a rig now. So as the rigging framework has evolved, I've developed a set of core data types that I draw upon for every rig build. These are the modular components of the rig. We have the model and any blend shapes that the rig might need to use. We have a rig guide, which is a Maya file made of curves and locators that set up where the bones should go. We have the rig builder class, which is a Python class that uses the rig code. And then we have exported skin weights and animation curve shapes. So these, I set them up and export them so that every time we re-export the rig or rebuild the rig, then it can just pull in the skin weights that it needs or pull in the curve file that it needs. We're going to take a look at that in action now, and I hope that it will make a bit of sense to you. Okay, so I have an empty Maya scene, and I'm just going to take you through the rig building process right now. Usually I would do this with one push button, but I'm going to break it down today so we can have a look at the steps involved. Again, this is not a rigging tutorial. This is more about the process of rebuilding and the philosophy around modular pipelines. So here we go. I've got my charcoal open. I'm just importing the Ava builder class and some utilities that I'm going to be using to import skins and stuff. First thing I'll do is just import that model file. We're using a LOD system, so there's just 2 models in here. this is really set up to use any number of geometry, just whatever we need. I'm going to import my rig guide now. And so the rig guide is, our rigs are made up of curve guides. So every module of the rig, let's take a look at the leg, has a curve with points for every major bone and then a couple of guiding locators. We do the foot stack for the foot roll setup that just sets the limits on the foot roll. And that's pretty simple. So other off-the-shelf rigging frameworks have their own guide system. M-Gear uses a curve guide. Advanced Skeleton, last I used it was using a skeleton guide. So it really doesn't matter, but it's really just a way to save down the data of where that skeleton is going to be built. So I'm just going to run the rig now. I'm going to call the Ava class and give it a couple seconds to run through. Our builder gives a couple of warnings depending on what's going on, and then I get this a lot. But as you can see, we've got a rig in the scene now. It is fully connected, but it's not got any skinning. The curve shapes are all horrible and yucky and stuck inside her body, but it is a fully connected rig. If I wanted to, I could switch between FK and IK. But obviously it's not going to do anything while it's not connected to Ava. So we're going to import her skin library. A skin library is just a JSON file that I've written that has a link to every mesh of a character and every skin file that they need. So I use my own skin weight exporter. It exports .skin files and we just bring them in with this. So Ava should be skinned now. I'm going to pull her knees away. And there we go. And so this is the skinning that I last exported, which is her game skinning. The curves are still horrible and yucky, so the last step is to just clean that up. It's just a little polish point. And then we have it. So my favorite part about these rebuilds is that they can be so iterative. If, say, Ava gets a new model update, we can really quickly and easily update her rig, rebuild it, and get it out to animation. Now that I've built Ava's rig, she's ready for testing, so I can pop over to an animation scene and take a look at it there. Here she is. And so this is a way that we can get really quick and iterative changes through the pipeline to be really modular, really communicative with our team, and just have those changes really quickly and easily. I'm very happy with where the rigging framework is right now. I think the rig performs as well as it needs to for the shows that we have, but I'll always be looking out for growth opportunities for upcoming projects. The areas I really want to expand on this rig system is in exporting, publishing, and the approval process. My next plan for it is to build a unit test that fires off a play blast with some testing animation so that we can really streamline the approval and testing processes. The next demo I have for you is the animation exporter. The automated steps here are to bake the export skeleton. We process blend shapes if they're needed. We process any prop targeting if that's needed. Set up the FBX settings to whatever the project needs them to be and export them to the given directory. A really important part of the user experience here for me is to give the user power to choose their export directory. Some of our tools used to very smartly guess where files needed to be exported for the project, but I moved to this system instead to give people the power to work off pipeline. So, if you want to do some personal work and use the exporter for whatever reason, or if you are testing something that's broken and want to export it to a safe directory, then you have the power to do that. So we're going to jump back to Maya and open up the Mighty Kingdom Asset Library, which is the file browser where we store all of our files. Now this asset library, you don't have to use it. I don't want to replace any workflows. I'd like to elevate workflows that we already have. So I'm going to pop over to Avas animation folder, which is pretty big, so it does take a bit of a minute to load. And here we have all of our crowns for assets that don't have icons. For animation, I usually work in the list view, and you can see all of the animation files in this project. So I'm not going to take you through the whole asset library. It's a little bit of an inspector, a little bit of a file browser, but what it does give us is a view of any metadata in the animation files that we're using and model rig files that we're using, and then a bit of control from the outset. So this one, I can see all of the actors or props that might be in a scene, and I can control them. I can edit the prop settings to say what bone it needs to bake to in the rig and things like that. So if I need to maybe re-export a couple of files, all I have to do is just pop over to the animation menu and export, and we'll come up with this little mapper. At Mighty Kingdom, we sort our animation files by the asset. So this will come up with a directory choice. So this tells us that we've got at least some files with Avas rig and at least some files with the soccer ball rig. So I can set an individual export directory for each of those. This is a fresh install on my computer, but usually this tool will remember your last settings. So you should only really have to set it once, and then every time you export that same rig again, it'll just pop up again and you say, okay, I'm not going to export those today because it will take a couple of minutes, but the output that we get from that is an FBX skeleton that should have all the right settings and baking done to it. I consider the asset library as being maybe in its first or second iteration of many. I have a lot of things I really want to do to it over time, which will need a lot of care and testing to be done really well. One of the really big changes I'd love to make in the future is to add full Perforce integration. I've written a P4 Python wrapper for Maya and need to find the time to work that in. So in that best world, artists, riggers, and animators will be able to check out and submit their files from Maya. We'll be able to have a look at change lists and use the history tools as well. So I would like to take a look back and summarize what we've been over today and what I'd really like you to get out of it. In this talk, we took a peek at some of the key steps in the content creation pipeline at Mighty Kingdom and how some of those steps might be modularized to suit multiple projects. We reviewed the rigging and export processes for 3 projects over time at Mighty Kingdom and looked at the growth of the overall pipeline over time. I gave you my top tips for success in automation and a demo on our current rigging and export processes. I really hope that by seeing the steps we've taken to grow over time, you'll be able to see the path for growth for your own processes and identify key opportunities for growth. A great pipeline is not built in a day. It can develop over years and over many, many projects. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really hope you have had a good time and are feeling a little inspired to seek out the growth opportunities in your own workflows. Here's my Twitter handle. I'd love to hear from you if you want to chat or follow up on anything, and I'm very excited to chat with you all in the Q&A. Thank you.